Welcome to Midnight Mysteries. If you feel like listening to a horror story, you're in the right place. Let me know what you think in the comments. Enjoy listening. We are in the year 2982. My name is Alex Mercer, a systems engineer and specialist in space operations, and I never imagined I would find myself at the center of a mission as critical as the one I am about to tell you about. My life, up to that point, had been fairly monotonous with ordinary assignments, but everything changed when I was selected for the recovery team sent to the Orion station. The call came on a cold January morning. The voice on the phone was that of my old mentor, Commander Harris, a veteran with numerous missions under his belt. "Alex," he said with a tone more serious than usual, "we need you. It's about the Orion station. We haven't received any messages from its inhabitants for too many days. It's as if it has vanished." The words hit me like a punch in the stomach. The Orion station was a cutting-edge research outpost at the farthest reaches of known space and was the jewel of our space technology. It was as large as a city and housed about 15,000 souls. It was a completely self-sufficient station, both in terms of energy and food. The onboard population lived a complete and parallel life compared to that lived by us on Earth. In addition to the onboard staff and researchers, there were entire families, doctors, teachers, researchers, cooks, and everything needed for a full and self-sufficient life. I arrived at the command center in less than an hour, finding a group of tense and worried people. The briefing was concise and direct. Orion Station had ceased all communication for a week. No distress signals, no messages, just silence. Our mission was very clear. Reach the station, assess the situation, and understand what had happened. I was assigned to an elite team, each of us an expert in our field. Biologists, doctors, engineers, military personnel, all of us knew that what we would find out there was uncertain, and every hypothesis was on the table. A technical disaster, human error, external contamination, or something worse. As the briefing continued, images of the station, with its silent corridors and advanced research labs, flashed on the screen. Something about those static and ghostly images unsettled me, a subtle but persistent feeling that something deeply wrong awaited us all out there in the cold darkness of space. With every piece of equipment checked and every procedure reviewed, we boarded the shuttle that would take us into the unknown. Each team member was lost in their thoughts. Some prayed, others mentally reviewed every procedure. I clung to my specialty, seeking comfort in the familiarity of systems and techniques I knew well. But deep down, a subtle voice warned me that nothing I knew or had experienced so far would prepare me for what awaited us in space. The journey to Orion Station was a series of long hours, marked only by the passing of distant stars beyond the shuttle's portholes. As we ventured deeper into space, the familiarity of Earth became a distant memory, replaced by a dark and silent vastness that seemed to swallow every certainty. The team members passed the time as best they could. There was Dr. Lena Koval, our onboard doctor, a woman with a sharp gaze and steady hand, who checked and rechecked her medical equipment with silent dedication. Then there was Ray Baxter, a communications specialist, always with a ready smile and a joke to lighten the tension, but his eyes betrayed a concern he tried to mask. Among us was also Maya Jensen, a biologist and geneticist, whose eyes lit up whenever she spoke of the possibilities of discoveries on the station, despite the circumstances being far from optimistic. And finally, there was Sergeant John Hawk Hawkins, our security officer, a man of few words with a look that seemed to have seen too much of the dark side of humanity and space. The days passed with brief meetings to discuss mission details, training sessions to keep body and mind active, and meals often consumed in a silence broken only by the clinking of cutlery. Occasionally, someone would try to break the monotonous succession of hours with stories of past missions or speculations on what we would find. But the truth was that there was tremendous tension in the air that grew with every hour of travel, a collective anxiety for the unknown that awaited us. During the journey, I found an unlikely friendship in Maya. Her inexhaustible curiosity and hope of finding answers to biological enigmas fascinated me. We spent hours discussing the possible discoveries the Orion station could offer, even though we both knew the main goal was to discover the fate of the missing crew. As we approached our destination, my mind often returned to the last images we had of the station. Those empty corridors and that absence of life. Occasionally, when everyone was asleep, I would wake up with a start, imagining hearing the ghostly sounds of SOS echoing from the station's corridors. I wondered if it was just my imagination or a premonition of what awaited us. As I mentioned before, the tension in the team became more palpable as the arrival time approached. Ray's jokes became less frequent, Lena's checks more meticulous, and Hawk's gaze more restless. When Commander Harris finally announced that we were in orbit around Orion Station, a silence full of anticipation gripped the shuttle. We looked at each other, aware that from that moment on, every step we took would bring us closer to the heart of a mystery none of us were truly certain we wanted to solve. As the shuttle approached Orion Station, I felt my heart rate increase. The immense structure floated in the darkness of space, a silent giant that seemed to watch us with invisible eyes. The beam of lights from the shuttle glided along the metal surface, highlighting the faded and scratched Union Space logo for micrometeorites. It was like approaching a floating ghost, a wreck abandoned in the infinite sea of space. The docking process was executed with surgical precision. Commander Harris piloted the shuttle remotely with an expert hand, anchoring us to the station's docking port. A slight jolt marked the completion of the docking, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, with a mechanical hiss, the hatch opened, revealing the passage between our shuttle and the station. The first to enter were me and Hawk, followed by Lena and Maya, with Ray last and destined to close the hatch behind him. Each step inside the station echoed in the empty corridors. The flickering lights cast eerie shadows, and the air itself seemed laden with a heavy and oppressive silence. The sensation of crossing the threshold of Orion Station was like stepping into a forgotten world. As my group and I ventured into the corridors, the light of our torches cut through the darkness, revealing details that heightened the already palpable tension. The first sector we explored was the command center, the station's beating heart. Darkened screens and empty chairs greeted us in a tomb-like silence. Hawk positioned himself strategically at the entrance while Lena, Maya, and I spread out to gather any useful data or documents. Ray stayed near the door, maintaining visual contact with all of us and monitoring our communications. As I scrolled through the consoles, I found the logbook. Most of the files were corrupted or deleted, but some surviving fragments revealed a crescendo of concern and paranoia among the crew. Mentions of technical failures, communication delays, and then, towards the end, frantic notes about noises in the ducts and shadows in the labs. It was as if they had begun to perceive a presence, or perhaps it was just the weight of isolation in deep space. Proceeding, we reached the living quarters where the crew's daily life had unfolded. Here the atmosphere grew even heavier. Half-drunk coffee cups and casually thrown clothes suggested a sudden departure or hasty abandonment. Lena stopped in front of a half-open cabin door. "Look," she said, pointing to the floor. There, traced in the dust, were drag marks, as if something or someone had been dragged away. We followed the marked path with our eyes until it disappeared into another dark corridor. None of us spoke, but I could sense the alarmed thoughts silently bouncing among us. We decided to head to the labs, hoping to find further clues. The labs were a jumble of equipment and workbenches. Slides, microscopes, and instruments for genetic and chemical analyses lay in disarray. It was evident they had been left in a hurry, some even broken in the commotion of the last moments. In one corner, a large table hosted what seemed to be an ongoing experiment. Test tubes contained biological samples of unclear origin. Maya approached, curious despite the context, and began analyzing the samples with a portable device. "This makes no sense," she murmured. "These cellular structures, they don't resemble anything I've ever seen." As we explored, occasionally, a sound or a movement at the edge of our perception made us stop and listen intently. Were they just the sounds of the station adjusting to our presence? Or was there something else, hidden in the shadows, watching us? With each step, the tension grew, and with it the feeling that every answer found only led to new and darker questions. With the determination of those who know they cannot turn back, we continued our exploration, ready to face whatever the silent labyrinth of metal and mystery that was Orion Station had in store for us. The deeper we delved into the station's depths, the more the air was saturated with a palpable sense of disorder and terror. Every module we explored seemed to tell a story of growing chaos and incomprehensible fear. The walls were marked with deep and irregular scratches, some so violent they had gouged the metal. In one corridor, we found what seemed to be the remnants of an improvised barricade, made of furniture and equipment hastily piled up. The most unsettling discovery awaited us in what was supposed to be the communications module. Broken screens and destroyed equipment filled the room. On the floor lay fragments of glass and metal, a testament to uncontrolled fury. It was as if someone, or something, had tried to prevent any possible contact with the outside world. Among the wreckage, we found a damaged but still functioning video recorder. With growing apprehension, we activated it. The face that emerged from the recorder was exhausted, and his voice was labored and marked by terror. It was one of the crew members, speaking of shadows in the corridors, of whispers haunting them in their sleep and waking moments. The recording ended with screams and a chaotic noise in the background, as if something had burst into the room. The message ended with a silence laden with unspoken meanings, leaving us with more questions than answers. Proceeding, we reached the Environmental Control Center. Here, the signs of destruction were even more evident. Control panels torn from the walls, exploded pipes dripping unknown fluids. In one corner, a pile of clothes and personal items had been chaotically accumulated, almost as if it had been the focal point of a last desperate attempt at protection. In an adjacent room, we found what remained of a video diary. The blurry figure of a man appeared on the screen, speaking with a voice broken by emotion. He spoke of nightmares becoming reality, of friends and colleagues disappearing without explanation. With a trembling voice, he described how the crew had become increasingly paranoid, seeing threats in every shadow, hearing voices that no one else could hear. The video abruptly ended, leaving us staring at the empty screen, each lost in our thoughts. The signs of struggle and madness were everywhere. In one lab, we found a pile of papers scribbled with frantic drawings and meaningless words, repeated endlessly. It was as if the mind of whoever had written them had collapsed under the weight of unimaginable horror. With each new clue, the tension grew. We moved with greater caution, communicating more by gestures than words, as the atmosphere thickened with mystery and terror around us. With silent resolve, we continued our exploration, determined to uncover the truth, whatever it might be. Our exploration led us to a sector of the station that appeared to have once been some sort of archive. Here we found a disordered collection of recordings. We couldn't listen to them all, there wasn't enough time. So we took a few samples to try to find some answers to our endless questions. An audio recording found by Lena made our skin crawl. The voice of a woman, clearly in shock, spoke of a darkness creeping among them, something ancient and incomprehensible. She described how some crew members had begun to behave strangely, talking to themselves or writing incomprehensible symbols on the walls. Then the screams, the sleepless nights, and finally the silence. Her message ended with a choked sob, a sound of despair that crossed space and time to reach us. Hawk discovered a series of video recordings hidden in a wall crack. The flickering images showed crew members talking in impromptu meetings, faces marked by fear and uncertainty. In one of these meetings, a figure stood up, accusing others of not seeing the truth, of being blind to the danger consuming them from within. His words were interrupted by others, his voice drowned out by shouts and accusations, until the recording ended in a chaos of movement and sounds. Maya, with slightly trembling hands, showed us the last find, a series of drawings made by a scientist. Each depicted symbols that seemed to mix mathematical elements and archaic rituals, accompanied by notes speaking of recurring dreams and visions. According to his words, these symbols had been revealed to him during experiments of communication with unknown entities. The last words were a delirium of confessions and warnings, a desperate plea to stop what they had started. We headed to the advanced research labs, where we hoped to find more concrete answers. These labs were the beating heart of Orion Station, where experiments at the edge of known science were conducted. Crossing the threshold of the first lab, we found ourselves facing a chaos of scientific equipment and monitoring systems. Some devices were still functioning, with screens flickering displaying incomprehensible data. It was clear that the scientists had worked on frontier projects, pushing beyond the limits of biology and physics. One of the projects seemed focused on spatial anomalies, particularly black holes and the effects of extreme gravity on living organisms. Complex diagrams and equations filled whiteboards and monitors, with notes talking about attempts to communicate with or even harness these cosmic entities. In another part of the lab, we came across the remains of biological experiments. Growth tanks contained tissues that did not resemble anything terrestrial, some still weakly pulsating under the soft light. Experiment records documented the rapid evolution of these samples, showing mutations and adaptations impossible in any known life form. The notes suggested that they had discovered or created new forms of life, perhaps as studies on extraterrestrial life or attempts to create organisms suitable for life in deep space. Maya examined the samples with a mixture of curiosity and horror. These organisms, they don't follow any of the rules of terrestrial biology, she commented. They're as if they were designed or evolved to survive in conditions we can't even imagine. In the lab, we also found a sealed area, evidently intended for particularly dangerous or secret studies. Behind the transparent security doors, we could see a room full of equipment, at the center of which stood a sort of capsule or containment chamber. It was not clear whether it was intended to house a sample or conduct experiments in controlled conditions. However, whatever its original purpose, it now lay abandoned. As we proceeded, the realization that something profoundly wrong and potentially dangerous had been unleashed here grew stronger. Every discovery brought us closer to the core of madness and terror that had consumed the crew. As we continued our exploration, the weight of the atmosphere and the macabre discoveries began to take a deep toll on us. The station, once a symbol of human progress, had turned into a labyrinth of nightmares, with each new discovery increasing our sense of isolation and danger. The first sign of tragedy struck us unexpectedly. We were in a secondary sector of the station, a maze of corridors and small service rooms, when Ray, who had been silently uneasy for hours, suddenly stopped. With an expression of incomprehensible terror, he began to mutter about voices he heard, calling him, tormenting him. Before we could react, he ran off screaming like a madman, blindly racing through the dark corridors. Hawk and I chased after him, calling his name, trying to reason with him, but it was as if madness had completely overtaken him. His frantic run ended tragically when, in blind panic, he threw himself through a hatch without heeding the danger signs. The dull thud of his body, hitting the metal floor several floors below, echoed in a heart-wrenching silence. When we reached the edge of the hatch, it was clear there was nothing more we could do for him. Ray's death shook everyone deeply. Anguish and remorse enveloped us like a fog, as we realized the station had already begun to claim its victims among us. Lena tried to maintain a professional demeanor, attending to procedures after the incident, but her eyes betrayed her distress. Hawk, always the most taciturn, gripped his rifle a bit tighter, his gaze constantly shifting toward the shadows surrounding us. The sense of isolation grew with every passing hour. Ray's death was a raw and violent reminder of the danger surrounding us. A danger that was not only physical but also threatened to overwhelm our minds. Every sudden noise made us jump. Every shadow could hide a new threat, real or imagined. Maya, trying to find a glimmer of rationality amid the madness, insisted on continuing to examine the samples and data collected, hoping they would provide some clue about what had happened on this station and what we had just witnessed with Ray's death. But even she, with her usual determination, could not hide the growing terror that was eroding us from within. With every step, every breath, the station tightened its grip on us. We were like trapped in a nightmare from which there was no awakening. And as we advanced, the memory of Ray, his desperate run and his tragic end, stayed with us as the awareness that each of us could be the next to fall victim to that invisible madness. After Ray's loss, the atmosphere became unbearable. The station's silence was laden with an oppressive presence, as if every empty corridor, every abandoned room was watching us, waiting. We were no longer alone in our grief and our mission. Something else was with us, an indefinable entity that fed on our fears and uncertainties. Lena was the first to notice changes in herself. While checking her medical supplies for the umpteenth time, she stopped, looking at her hands trembling slightly. "Do you see these lights?" she asked uncertainly. She looked toward a dark corner of the module, staring at something only she could see. There were moments when she seemed to hear voices none of us could hear, responding with frightened looks or confused murmurs. Maya also began to behave strangely. During the analysis of some samples, she suddenly froze, her gaze fixed on a point beyond the portable microscope. She spoke in a low voice, as if conversing with someone beside her, discussing the results with an invisible colleague. When I called her, it took several seconds for her to respond, shaking her head as if to free herself from a persistent dream. As for me, I began to perceive subtle distortions in the reality around me. Corridors that seemed to stretch beyond what was possible, whispers echoing from impossible directions, shadows moving just at the edge of my vision. More than once, I turned suddenly, certain I had seen someone or something moving behind me, only to find nothing. My rational mind tried to dismiss these visions as the product of stress and grief over Ray's loss. But a deep shiver told me there was something more sinister and alien lurking. Hawk, though remaining the most composed of us, was not immune. His vigilance had turned into paranoia, every noise making him react with tense and violent readiness. More than once, I caught him staring intently into the dark corridors, his rifle always ready, as if he expected something terrible to attack us at any moment. With minds and bodies exhausted, we kept pushing forward, driven by a desperate need to find answers, to understand the nature of the influence that was tearing us apart. But with every step, with every breath, we came closer to an abyss of madness and terror, an abyss that threatened to swallow us before we could uncover the truth hidden in the dark and silent depths of the station. As we advanced, It became increasingly clear that the madness that had struck our crew was only the tip of the iceberg compared to the much deeper horror that had consumed the inhabitants of Orion Station. Each new discovery offered us another piece of the tragic puzzle that had been the fate of the missing crew. In an abandoned research module, we found what seemed to be the core of this descent into chaos. At the center of the room was a large hologram, still partially active, projecting a representation of what seemed to be an entity or a spatial phenomenon. It was a swirling mass of colors and shapes that continuously changed, almost hypnotic. Scattered documents on the desk spoke of received communications, encrypted messages in an unknown language promising knowledge and power beyond imagination. But among these promises, there were also warnings, notes of growing terror as the crew began to understand what they had truly found, or what had found them. In a corner, half hidden under debris and glass shards, was a personal video diary. The first recordings were full of optimism and excitement for the discoveries made, but as they progressed, the words became more frantic, the stories darker. The author described how colleagues and friends began to change, talking to themselves, drawing incomprehensible symbols on the walls and their bodies. He spoke of vivid nightmares that did not leave them even during wakefulness, of visions of other worlds that called to them, consumed them. In a recording room, we found the sad epilogue of these diaries. A series of videos showed the crew's last days. Members spoke to the camera with wide eyes and broken voices, witnessing their descent into madness. They told of how some had tried to destroy communications with the entity, how others had embraced the madness, seeing it as an ascension to a new reality. The last recordings were confused, full of screams and running, the camera fallen to one side as chaos engulfed everything. One crew member appeared more frequently in the recordings, a man who seemed to be the chief scientist or project leader. Towards the end, his presence became increasingly disturbing. Speaking directly to the camera with a mad smile, he described their awakening as a gift, a passage to a new existence where humanity was only a distant memory. Our path finally led us to a remote sector of the station, a space that seemed to have once been a kind of personal study. It was here that we felt, even before seeing, the presence of someone. A whisper, a shiver in the air, as if the very environment was breathing with an anxious and irregular rhythm. Cautiously, we approached the entrance, our steps echoing in a strangely distorted manner in the corridors. Hawk took the lead, advancing with his rifle raised, while the rest of us followed closely, every sense on alert. The door was ajar, swinging slightly as if inviting or challenging anyone who dared to approach. It was Lena who pushed the door, revealing the scene inside. The room was a vortex of chaos and destruction, with documents, equipment fragments, and symbols drawn everywhere. At the center, among a pile of cushions and rags, was a man, or at least what remained of a man. His eyes were wide open, staring into the void, and his skin was marked with intricate designs and words carved like deep scars. As soon as we entered, his gaze shifted to us, a flash of consciousness, or perhaps madness, passing through his eyes. With slow movements, he stood up, his tattered clothes fluttering around him like the rags of a flag. His voice was a scratchy whisper, a sound that seemed to crawl along the walls and infiltrate our minds. "You shouldn't have come here," he said with a tone that was a mix of warning and despair. "You don't know what you've released, what we released." His eyes moved among us, a shiver of terror passing through his glances. "It's too late for us, but maybe you can still escape." "We were blind," he whispered with a hint of crying in his voice, "blind to the truth, until it was too late." As he spoke, his eyes clouded, lost in memories or visions only he could see. His last words were a mix of warning and pity. "Don't let it touch you. The darkness, it is hungry. It is always hungry." Then suddenly his face contorted in an aberrant way, and he lunged at Lena, who was the closest to him. Hawk managed to get between them and pushed him back. As if nothing had happened, the man charged again, this time at Hawk, with a vacant stare and drool running down his cheeks. Hawk didn't hesitate and used his rifle to end his suffering once and for all. After that event, we were drawn like a magnet to a section we had not yet explored. It's strange to explain in words, but the pulsating heart of this dark presence seemed to emanate from a particularly isolated sector of the station. As we approached, the air grew heavier, charged with an almost palpable energy. Every step echoed with a distorted resonance, as if space itself was contorting around us. Without warning, the corridor ahead of us opened into a vast atrium, at the center of which lay what could only be the station's core or the focus of the experiments conducted. It was an immense circular chamber, the walls studded with screens and instruments now inactive or destroyed. At the center, suspended in an anti-gravity field, was an object that defied description. It was a mass of dark, pulsating matter, a tangle of tentacles and eyes, of mouths and claws that seemed to float and move in an eternal, tortuous change. It was neither solid nor liquid, nor entirely alive in the way we understand, but it emanated a sense of terrible awareness, of insatiable hunger. It was as if every nightmare and fear had been distilled into a pure essence, an abomination that the human mind could barely comprehend. As soon as we entered, the entity moved, its tentacles extending slowly toward us, as if to probe the air. Its eyes, if they could be called that, fixed on us, and a chilling shiver ran down our spines. It was as if it could see inside us, read every thought, every emotion. Hawk was the first to react, firing his rifle at the undulating mass. But the bullet seemed absorbed or deflected by an invisible barrier, ineffective against the horror confronting us. Lena screamed a warning, trying to drag us away, but it was as if we were paralyzed, captured by the overwhelming presence of the entity. The entity emitted a sound, a roar or a wail that filled the air, vibrating in our bones and minds. It was a call, a command, and under its weight, we began to feel our will crumble. Horrible visions presented themselves before our eyes, showing us fragments of impossible realities, devastated worlds, futures where humanity was nothing but a distant memory. Maya fell to her knees, hands pressed against her ears in a vain attempt to block the sound. Lena struggled desperately to maintain her sanity. Hawk continued to shoot, each shot a futile vent against the horror oppressing us. In the climax of that desperate battle against the entity, the realization of our situation made its way through the chaos and terror assailing us. We could not defeat it, at least not with the means at our disposal. It was an abomination beyond human understanding, a horror that did not belong to this world, or perhaps any known world. Its mere existence defied every law of nature and sanity. Amidst a wave of pain and anger, I found myself shouting to the others, trying to bring them back to reality, to push them to make a decision, any decision. Hawk ceased firing, his eyes still full of fierce determination, but now also a clear understanding of the futility of his efforts. Lena, with tears in her eyes from the despair and horror of what we had seen and experienced, joined me, trying to find a way out of the impossible situation. We can't let this thing, this abomination, exist, I yelled, my voice breaking with effort and fear. We have to destroy the station. We have to make sure no one can ever wake or encounter this horror again. Hawk nodded with a grave expression. It might be the only way, he admitted. We have to activate the station's self-destruct or something similar. It's a risk, but it's better to die trying to stop this thing than to leave it free to destroy everything. Lena looked around, almost as if seeking confirmation or hope in the dark and silent corridors of the station. What if we don't make it out in time? She asked, her voice trembling. What if this becomes our tomb? It's a risk we have to take, I replied, feeling the weight of each word. For ourselves, for the people we love, for all of humanity. We have to do everything possible to stop it here and now. With a silent agreement, we headed to the station's control center, where we hoped to find the means to activate a self-destruct protocol or at least cause enough damage to seal the station and the entity within it. The path to the control center was a whirlwind of emotions and frantic thoughts. We had to be quick, decisive, ready to sacrifice everything to prevent the entity from ever threatening our world. With the determination of the condemned, we made our way to the station's control center. The route was a labyrinth of increasingly distorted corridors by the creature's presence, as if the very structure of the station responded to its eerie influence. The lights flickered hypnotically, and the alarm systems emitted strangled and intermittent sounds, creating a dissonant chorus that accompanied our desperate march. Hawk led the group, his military experience and firmness the only certainty amid the chaos. I followed, feeling the weight of every decision made, every step bringing us closer to the climax of our mission. Upon reaching the control center, we found a scene of destruction. Control panels destroyed, screens shattered, and wires hanging from ceilings and walls like the entrails of a torn body. Despite the evident damage, we hurried to find a still functioning terminal, hoping to access the station's self-destruct systems. While we searched among the debris, a noise made us jump. From the shadows of an adjacent corridor emerged a form, a remnant of the original crew now transformed into something unrecognizable. It was a humanoid being, but its features were distorted, skin marked by pulsating symbols, and eyes void of any light of reason. It emitted a high-pitched scream and lunged at us with unnatural movements. Hawk reacted instinctively, engaging the creature in a brutal hand-to-hand fight. Eventually, Hawk managed to overpower it, but not without suffering severe injuries. While Lena rushed to assist Hawk, the gravity of our situation became even clearer. Every minute spent was another minute allowing the entity to approach, to influence us, to consume us. Finally, among the remains of a semi-intact control panel, I found what I was looking for: access to the station's emergency protocols. Time seemed to stretch, every second an eternity as we worked to activate the protocol. And then, with one last press of a button, the protocol was activated. A countdown began to tick on one of the remaining screens, marking the time we had left. The entity's roar echoed through the station, a sound of rage and despair that seemed to shake the very foundations of the complex. It knew what we had done, and its fury unleashed with renewed intensity. Now, with the countdown in progress and Hawk gravely wounded, we had no choice but to attempt a desperate escape to the shuttle, hoping to flee the destruction we had unleashed. With hearts pounding and minds clouded by terror, we started running, leaving behind the station's pulsating heart, ready to sacrifice everything to stop the horror we had awakened. The countdown continued inexorably as we ran to the shuttle, every second a precious heartbeat separating us from total destruction. Hawk, supported by Lena, left a trail of blood behind him. Despite his injuries, however, his fighting spirit did not waver. His determination to protect us an unquenchable flame even in the darkness surrounding us. Maya, her face marked by tears and terror, followed closely, helping Lena support Hawk. Every now and then, a lost look in the dark corridors, a startle at a sudden noise, revealed the unbearable weight on her shoulders. Time seemed to dilate and contract bizarrely. Each corridor passed a small triumph, each new turn a new horror to face. And then, when it seemed we might make it, that the shuttle was almost within reach, a jolt made us all stumble, causing Hawk to fall to the floor in a pool of his own blood. The entity, in its blind fury, was trying to prevent our escape, its influences distorting the reality around us. A ceiling collapsed right in front of us, a mass of debris blocking our path. Hawk, with a look mixing resignation and defiance, pushed us back. "Go!" he shouted, his voice choked with pain and exhaustion. "Save yourselves. Stop that thing." Lena and Maya tried to protest, but he interrupted them with a desperate scream, a final command that allowed no reply. In a moment of clarity, I realized that every second spent there was another second less we had to escape the destruction. I grabbed Lena and Maya, dragging them away as Hawk stayed behind, a solitary figure in the darkness. We reached the shuttle with hearts in our throats, the countdown now marking only a few minutes. With trembling hands, I activated the departure systems, feeling the station tremble around us in one last, desperate attempt by the entity to hold its prey. The shuttle detached with a jolt, moving away from the station. Looking back through the hatch, I saw the station explode in a silent conflagration, a fire consuming everything, the entity and the secrets it had guarded. For a moment, an image of the original crew, of Hawk, of all those who had suffered and lost their lives in that cursed place, passed before my eyes, a memory that perhaps would stay with me forever.